August 13th, 1906. Brownsville, Texas, 6:30 in the morning. Sergeant Mingo Sanders kneels in the dusty barracks of Fort Brown, his knees pressed against rough wooden planks worn smooth by decades of soldiers' boots. He's 42 years old, a veteran who survived Spanish bullets in Cuba, and right now he's praying harder than he ever prayed on any battlefield. Around him, 166 other black soldiers from the 25th Infantry Regiment bow their heads, Bibles open to passages they've marked and remarked until the pages threaten to fall apart. The humid Gulf air hangs thick in that room, heavy with salt from the nearby coast and something else. Tension. Fear. The kind of fear that settles in your chest when you know something terrible is coming, but you can't see it yet. Outside these barracks, white mobs have been prowling the streets of Brownsville for weeks now, shouting slurs that would make you sick to hear them. These soldiers have heard every word. They've endured every insult. They've watched white townspeople spit at their uniforms, the same uniforms they wore when they defended America's borders, when they charged up San Juan Hill, when they protected white settlers from raids along the Rio Grande. And they've stood there and taken it, because that's what soldiers do. That's what black soldiers have always done in America. Endure, survive, prove your worth over and over again, while knowing it will never be enough. Then suddenly, gunfire erupts. 167 shots tear through the pre-dawn darkness, coming from shadowy figures positioned in the brush outside the fort. The sound is deafening, bullets ripping through the night air like angry hornets, ricocheting off buildings, shattering windows, splintering wood. One white bartender falls dead in the street. Another man staggers away wounded, blood streaming down his arm. Dogs bark frantically, women scream, men shout. And inside that barracks, these trained soldiers instinctively reach for their rifles, their bodies moving with the muscle memory of men who've faced combat before. But orders freeze them in place. Stand down. Don't move. Don't defend yourselves. Don't even look like you're thinking about defending yourselves. So they stand there, weapons in hand but not raising them, while chaos explodes around them and the smell of gunpowder drifts through their windows like poison gas. By dawn, shell casings litter the ground outside Fort Brown. Physical proof of an ambush. Physical evidence that someone attacked this fort and these soldiers. Yet when the sun rises over Brownsville that morning, the headlines don't read attack on black soldiers. They scream Negro uprising, race riot, black troops run wild. Every newspaper from Texas to New York will repeat these lies. Every politician will condemn these men. And the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt himself, the man these soldiers helped elect, the man who rode to glory on the backs of black cavalry regiments, will personally destroy every single one of them. What happened next would dishonor heroes, erase legacies, and stain America for 100 years. Everything you learned about loyal soldiers serving their country was a lie. These men guarded your borders. They won your wars. They asked for nothing but the dignity their service earned. And in return, the president betrayed them in a way so complete, so vicious, so calculated, that it would set the pattern for how America treats black excellence for the next century. How do 167 black soldiers protect America, only to be framed and erased by its leader? How does a president discharge war heroes without trial, without evidence, without even pretending to care about justice? And why does this matter to you right now, today, in 2025? This is the Brownsville Affair they buried. This is your stolen honor, and you're about to learn the truth they never wanted you to know. Today, we're going to expose the buried truth about Brownsville 1906. 167 black soldiers, Buffalo soldiers who spent years protecting the Texas border from raids out of Mexico, were accused by President Theodore Roosevelt of shooting up a white town. no trial, no evidence, no investigation that wasn't rigged from the start. They were dishonorably discharged as a group, stripped of their pensions, their names dragged through mud that would stick for generations, their military records stamped with dishonor, their service erased, their families shamed. And here's what makes it worse. These weren't just any soldiers. These were combat veterans, men who had charged San Juan Hill in Cuba, men who had survived the jungles of the Philippines, men who had spent a decade keeping American settlers safe from cross-border violence. And in one night, on the word of white townspeople who hated them, and a president who didn't care enough to find out the truth, all of that meant nothing. This isn't ancient history that has nothing to do with your life. This is your legacy. Your grandparents lived through this era. Your great-grandparents might have known these men, or men just like them. This moment in 1906 set patterns that explain why your family struggles today. The wealth gap between black and white families didn't happen by accident. The discrimination black veterans still face in the military didn't come from nowhere. The way America treats black excellence, black achievement, black success, it all connects back to moments like Brownsville, where they literally could not allow black men to be heroes without punishment. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how the military covered up 167 shell casings that came from white civilians' guns and blamed black soldiers instead. You'll learn about the battle honors that were erased, the victories at San Juan Hill that history books downplayed, the 10 years of border service that got written out of the record. You'll see the pattern connecting Brownsville to at least 5 other massacres where black communities thrived until white mobs destroyed them, from Wilmington in 1898 to Tulsa in 1921. And you'll never look at reparations the same way again. You'll never think about military service the same way. You'll never wonder why black families don't have generational wealth when you see how systematically it was stolen. This affects your life today, right now. The neighborhood you live in, the school your kids attend, the job opportunities you don't have, the inheritance you never received. All of it traces back to moments like this, and they never wanted you to know. They wanted Brownsville buried so deep you'd never ask questions. They wanted these soldiers forgotten so you wouldn't see the pattern. They wanted you to believe the lies they printed in newspapers, the lies they taught in schools, the lies they repeated until they became the official story. But today, the truth comes out, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know what they did to Mingo Sanders and Fred Hunter and 165 other men whose names deserve to be remembered, you'll understand why your family's story is what it is. You'll understand why justice delayed is justice denied. And you'll understand why this fight isn't over, not by a long shot. Let me introduce you to the men they tried to erase. Not statistics, not numbers, not a faceless group of soldiers. Real men with real lives, real families, real dreams that were stolen from them on a hot August night in Texas. Sergeant Mingo Sanders, born in Georgia in 1864, right as the Civil War was tearing the country apart. His father was enslaved. Think about that. His father lived as property, and Mingo grew up in the chaos of Reconstruction. That brief moment after slavery ended, when black people thought maybe, just maybe, America would make good on its promises. He joined the army in 1884, 20 years old, and looking for a way to prove himself in a country that saw him as less than human. By 1906, he'd served 22 years. 22 years of guarding frontier posts. 22 years of tracking outlaws through brutal Texas heat. 22 years of expert marksmanship that made him one of the best shots in the regiment. He trained younger soldiers. He led patrols along the Rio Grande. He did everything the army asked and more. And at 42 years old, on his knees in that barracks, He had no idea his career was about to end in the worst way possible. Corporal Fred Hunter, born in Kentucky in 1878, came from a military family. 3 brothers, all serving, all trying to make something of themselves through the only institution that would give black men a chance at respect. Fred was a veteran of the Philippines campaign, had survived disease and ambushes and the particular hell of jungle warfare. He came back to the States and got stationed at Fort Brown, thinking he'd earned some peace, some safety. He was wrong. Private John Hollins, born in Virginia in 1882, 24 years old in 1906, married, with his wife and children living in quarters near the barracks. He was a scout, had skills in tracking and reconnaissance that the army desperately needed on the border. He'd go out for days at a time, mapping terrain, watching for raiders, reporting back intelligence that kept settlements safe. His kids looked up to him. His wife was proud of his uniform. And in one night, all of that pride turned to shame they didn't deserve. Sergeant William Washington, born in South Carolina in 1869. He was the spiritual leader of the regiment, the man who led prayer every single night, who kept Bibles in his footlocker and handed them out to soldiers who needed comfort. When men were homesick, when they were scared, when they doubted whether serving a country that hated them was worth it, William Washington reminded them of a higher purpose. He reminded them that righteousness would prevail, that God saw their service even if America didn't. Imagine being that man, having that faith, and watching everything you believed in get destroyed by your own government. Private David Stamps, born in Louisiana in 1885. He survived the Galveston hurricane of 1900, one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. 8,000 people died in that storm, and David Stamps walked out of it alive, joined the army, and thought he'd seen the worst life could throw at him. He had no idea that man-made cruelty would prove worse than any hurricane, and there were more. Corporal Jesse Reed, Private Frank Lipscomb, Sergeant James Young, Corporal Lewis Russell, Private Isaac Barnes. Every single one of them had fought at San Juan Hill in 1898. They'd charged up that hill under Spanish fire, while Theodore Roosevelt, then just a colonel leading the Rough Riders, got all the glory. Those black soldiers did the actual fighting, took the actual casualties, secured the actual victory, and Roosevelt rode their sacrifice all the way to the White House. Then he thanked them by destroying their lives. This was the era of Jim Crow spreading like cancer across the South. This was Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, when America was flexing its muscles as a new world power, and black soldiers were the tool they used for that flex, then discarded when convenient. These men served at Fort Brown on the Texas-Mexico border, a strategic location where raids from Mexican outlaws and revolutionaries were constant threats. They also served at other posts. Some had been to Cuba for the Spanish-American War, some to the Philippines to crush an independence movement, some to frontier forts in Montana and Wyoming and New Mexico, where they'd protected white settlers who called them slurs to their faces. 10 different locations shaped their service. Fort Brown itself, the Matamoros border crossing where they stopped smugglers, San Juan Hill in Cuba, where they earned medals that would later be stripped away, Manila in the Philippines, where they fought in swamps and jungles, frontier posts across the American West, where they became known as Buffalo Soldiers, a name given by Native Americans who fought them and respected them in equal measure. These men knew geography most Americans would never see. They knew hardship most Americans couldn't imagine. And they knew that no matter how well they served, a significant portion of white America would always hate them for daring to wear the uniform with pride. By August 1906, they'd been stationed at Fort Brown for 2 years. 2 years of increasing tension with the white townspeople of Brownsville, who resented their presence. 2 years of incidents where white civilians would harass black soldiers, provoke them, try to start fights, then complain to authorities when the soldiers defended themselves. 2 years of the soldiers showing restraint that no white regiment would ever be expected to show. And it all came to a head on August 13th, the night of August 13th, 1906, 10 p.m. A white mob of about 190 men gathers outside a saloon near Fort Brown. They've been drinking. They've been working themselves up with racist rhetoric. They've been planning something, though exactly what remains disputed. What's not disputed is that these soldiers, these 167 black men, are in their barracks following orders. They're not out in town. They're not causing trouble. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. Then gunfire erupts. 167 shots from Springfield .45 caliber rifles. Not the Krag-Jorgensen rifles issued to the 25th Infantry. Different weapons entirely. The bullets come from the brush outside the fort, from positions where civilians are hiding, and they tear through the night, targeting the town, not the barracks. One bartender, a white man, falls dead. Another white man staggers away wounded. And immediately, before any investigation, before any evidence is gathered, the cry goes up. The Negro soldiers are rioting. The black troops have gone mad. Lock them down. Disarm them. Court-martial them all. Inside the barracks, the soldiers are on their knees. Some are praying. Some are reading their Bibles, books of Exodus open to passages about deliverance and freedom. Some are just trying to understand what's happening. They hear the shots. They hear the screams. They see their white commanding officers running around in panic. And they receive orders that will define this moment forever. Stand down. Do not engage. Do not leave the barracks. Do not defend yourselves or this fort or anything else. Just stand there and wait to be blamed for something you didn't do. Think about what that means. You're a trained soldier. You hear gunfire. Your instinct is to respond, to protect, to fight if necessary. But your orders are to do nothing, to be a target, to let whatever's happening happen, and then to accept whatever consequences come after, no matter how unjust. The investigation that followed was a farce from the start. Major Charles Penrose, the white officer in charge of Fort Brown, personally collected shell casings from the scene. He knew these casings came from civilian weapons. He had to know. Any officer with basic training can identify different caliber rounds, but he collected them anyway and filed a report that blamed the soldiers. Major August Bloxham arrived to conduct a formal investigation, and he rejected every alibi the 167 soldiers provided. They were sleeping. They have witnesses. They have each other's testimony. None of it matters. Bloxham decides they're all lying, all 167 of them, in perfect coordination, to cover up a crime they didn't commit. 10 white witnesses from the town give testimony. Every single one of them has been coached, bribed, or threatened to say the shots came from the fort. Even though the physical evidence contradicts this, even though the shell casings are the wrong type, even though basic ballistics would prove the firing positions were outside the fort, not inside, none of that matters. The official story is set before the investigation even begins. Black soldiers rioted. That's the conclusion. Now find evidence to support it. And here's where you need to pause and reflect on what this means. These men protected America. They guarded borders. They fought wars. They asked for nothing except fair treatment. And America couldn't even give them a fair investigation. America couldn't even pretend to care about evidence or truth or justice. America just needed a scapegoat, needed to put these black soldiers back in their place, needed to send a message to every other black person who thought military service might earn them respect. The message was clear. You will never be equal. You will never be safe. You will never be believed over white people, no matter what you've done or how well you've served. Your service means nothing. Your sacrifices mean nothing. Your lives mean nothing. The aftermath came swift and brutal. August 25th, 1906, 12 days after the shooting, President Theodore Roosevelt issues an executive order dishonorably discharging all 167 soldiers without trial. Read that again. Without trial. The President of the United States, the man who claims to believe in American justice, who lectures the world about democracy and rule of law, discharges 167 men without giving them a day in court. No jury, no defense, no chance to present evidence or cross-examine witnesses. Just gone, erased, dishonored. 6 of those soldiers were wounded veterans who had shed blood for America. 14 had been preparing for retirement, years of service about to pay off with a pension they'd earned. All of it gone in one stroke of Roosevelt's pen, and the consequences rippled out like shockwaves through 167 families, 167 communities, generations who would grow up knowing their grandfather or great-grandfather had been dishonorably discharged and not knowing the truth of what really happened. Mingo Sanders, that sergeant who'd served 22 years, died poor in 1918. 12 years after Brownsville, he died without his pension, without his honor, without anyone in power caring that they'd destroyed a good man's life over a lie. Fred Hunter couldn't find work after his discharge. Nobody wants to hire a soldier with a dishonorable discharge. It follows you everywhere, marks you as untrustworthy, criminal, dangerous. He bounced from city to city, trying to start over and never quite managing it. More than 50 of these soldiers committed suicide or died young, their lives cut short by poverty, despair, and the knowledge that their country had betrayed them. The consequences for families were catastrophic. No pensions meant no financial security, no death benefits, no support for widows and children. These families had planned their futures around that military pension, had made sacrifices during years of service, expecting it would pay off eventually. And in one moment, it was all taken away. Some families didn't recover financially for generations. You can trace poverty in certain black families directly back to Brownsville, directly back to that stolen pension, that erased service, that systematic destruction of black wealth, and the military accomplishments they'd earned. Those got erased too. The 25th Infantry Regiment had won 20 battles along the Mexican border between 1890 and 1906. 20 victories protecting American settlements, stopping raids, maintaining order in dangerous territory. They'd earned commendations. They'd earned respect from fellow soldiers who fought beside them. They'd earned a place in military history. All of it wiped away after Brownsville. The Army quietly removed their battle honors from official records. West Point stopped teaching about their role at San Juan Hill. History books that mentioned Buffalo soldiers started downplaying their importance or leaving them out entirely. By the 1920s, it was as if the 25th Infantry Regiment had never existed. As if Mingo Sanders and Fred Hunter and John Hollins and 164 other men had never worn the uniform, never served, never sacrificed anything. That's what America does to black excellence. When you rise too high, when you succeed too much, when you dare to claim the honor you've earned, they find a way to tear you down. They find a way to make you an example. They find a way to remind everyone else what happens when black people forget their place. And Brownsville was the blueprint for a pattern that would repeat over and over for the next century. But here's what they didn't count on. You finding out. You learning the truth. You refusing to let these men stay forgotten. Because Brownsville wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't one bad decision by one prejudiced president. It was part of a system, a pattern, a deliberate strategy that America used over and over whenever black communities built something, achieved something, dared to thrive. And I'm going to prove it to you right now, with 4 other events that follow the exact same playbook. Same tactics, same lies, same erasure. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. November 10th, 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina. 8 years before Brownsville, this coastal city had something white supremacists couldn't tolerate: a thriving black middle class, black elected officials, black newspaper editors, black business owners. The city government was mixed race, functioning successfully, proving that Reconstruction-era progress could actually work if given a chance. The Daily Record, a black-owned newspaper, was publishing editorials that challenged white supremacy. Black men held positions as aldermen, magistrates, police officers. They weren't asking for permission. They were exercising rights they'd earned as citizens and voters. White supremacists across North Carolina watched this and made a plan. They called it redemption. They organized for months, holding rallies where speakers openly called for violence, recruiting men into paramilitary groups, stockpiling weapons. They published a manifesto called the White Declaration of Independence that literally called for the overthrow of Wilmington's government. And on November 10th, they made their move. 2,000 armed white men marched through Wilmington's black neighborhoods. They burned the Daily Record building first, torching the printing press that had dared to publish truth. Then they moved through the streets systematically, shooting black residents on sight. Men running for their lives were gunned down in the street. Families hiding in their homes were dragged out and executed. The exact death toll will never be known because they hid the bodies, dumped them in the Cape Fear River, buried them in unmarked graves. Official records say 14 dead. Survivors and historians estimate between 60 and 300 people were murdered that day. But here's what makes it genocide, not just a riot. They didn't just kill people. They overthrew the government. They forced the mayor to resign at gunpoint. They expelled every black elected official from the city. They installed their own white supremacist government and called it liberation. And the federal government did nothing. President McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt's predecessor, received reports of armed insurrection against a legitimate city government and chose to ignore it. Chose to let white supremacists stage a coup on American soil. Chose to let them murder dozens or hundreds of black citizens and get away with it completely. The cover-up was immediate and thorough. Newspapers outside North Carolina reported it as a race riot, implying black people started it. They used passive language, talking about unrest and violence, without naming who committed the murders. They interviewed white perpetrators who claimed self-defense against a Negro uprising that never happened. And in North Carolina itself, the new white government made it illegal to even talk about what happened. Witnesses were threatened into silence. Survivors who fled the city were told never to return. And for 93 years, from 1898 until 1991, Wilmington's official history books didn't mention the massacre, didn't acknowledge the coup, didn't name a single victim. They called it the Wilmington Race Riot and taught children that both sides were equally responsible for unrest. It wasn't until 2000, 102 years later, that North Carolina formed a commission to study what really happened. And even then, even with overwhelming evidence of premeditated mass murder and insurrection, the state refused to pay reparations to descendants, refused to return property that was stolen, refused to do anything except say, yes, this happened, we acknowledge it, now let's move on. Do you see the pattern starting to form? Thriving black community. White mob destroys it. Government does nothing or actively helps the mob. Media lies about what happened. History erases it. Descendants get nothing. Wilmington, 1898. Remember that formula because you're about to see it again. September 30th, 1919. Elaine, Arkansas. 21 years after Wilmington. 13 years after Brownsville. World War I just ended, and black soldiers are coming home expecting things to be different. They fought for democracy in Europe. They wore the uniform. They saved white soldiers' lives. Surely that earned them something, right? Wrong. They come home to Jim Crow worse than ever, to lynchings increasing, to white America terrified that black veterans might not accept second-class citizenship anymore. In Elaine, a small town in the Arkansas Delta, black sharecroppers are organizing. They're forming a union called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. They're hiring white lawyers to sue white plantation owners who have been cheating them for decades. See, sharecropping was slavery by another name. You work the land, you grow the cotton, and at the end of harvest, the white landowner tells you what you owe for rent and supplies. The math always works out, so you owe more than you earned. You're trapped in permanent debt, generation after generation. It's brilliant if you're evil. It's torture if you're the one living it. So these sharecroppers decide enough. They're going to demand fair accounting, fair wages, the right to sell their cotton to whoever offers the best price. Reasonable requests, legal requests, requests that terrified white plantation owners, because if sharecroppers started getting paid fairly, the entire economic system of the South would collapse. On September 30th, black farmers gather at a church in Hoop Spur, just outside Elaine, to meet with their union organizers. White men, likely hired by plantation owners, surround the church and open fire. The farmers fire back, defending themselves. One white attacker dies, and that's all the excuse needed. By the next morning, hundreds of white men from Arkansas and Mississippi descend on Elaine. The governor calls in federal troops, 500 soldiers, supposedly to restore order. Instead, they join the white mobs in hunting black residents. For 3 days, they terrorize Phillips County. They go farm to farm, house to house, killing any black person they find. Men are shot in fields. Women are murdered in their homes. Children watch their parents die. The official death toll is 5 white men and 2 black people. That's what Arkansas claimed. Survivors and investigators later estimated between 100 and 237 black people were massacred. Bodies were dumped in the Mississippi River. Bodies were buried in mass graves that have never been located. Bodies simply disappeared, families never knowing what happened to their loved ones. And then came the ultimate injustice. Instead of arresting the white mob, Arkansas arrested 285 black residents and charged them with insurrection. 12 black men were sentenced to death for the crime of defending themselves in church. The trials were a mockery. All white juries, no real defense allowed, convictions in minutes. The NAACP fought those convictions for years, eventually getting them overturned by the Supreme Court. But the damage was done. The message was sent. Organize for fair wages, and you'll be massacred. Survive the massacre, and you'll be executed for it. The cover-up was built into the official response. The governor of Arkansas, a man named Charles Brew, personally went on a speaking tour, claiming there had been a Negro insurrection, a planned uprising to murder white people and take over the county. He presented zero evidence because none existed. But newspapers printed his lies as fact. History books repeated those lies for decades. School children in Arkansas learned that black sharecroppers tried to start a race war in 1919. They didn't learn about union organizing, didn't learn about wage theft, didn't learn about white mobs murdering hundreds of people with government support. They learned a lie, memorized it, taught it to their children. It wasn't until the 1990s, 70 years later, that historians started uncovering the truth. And Arkansas still hasn't paid reparations, still hasn't compensated descendants, still hasn't done anything except acknowledge, yeah, that was bad, and move on. Wilmington, 1898. Elaine, 1919. The pattern is getting clearer, but it gets worse, because sometimes they didn't just destroy black communities. Sometimes they erased them so completely, it was as if they never existed at all. January 1st, 1923. Rosewood, Florida. New Year's Day. A small town of about 350 residents, mostly black, with a few white families. This isn't a poor community. These are black people who own their land. They have successful farms. They have a church, a school, a baseball team, a Masonic lodge. They're not rich, but they're stable, independent, building something for their children. And that independence is about to get them killed. January 1st, a white woman in nearby Sumner, a town about 3 miles away, claims a black man attacked her. She has no evidence, no witnesses, no description that makes sense. Later, people will suspect she's covering up for a white lover her husband doesn't know about. But in 1923 Florida, an accusation from a white woman is all it takes. A mob forms immediately. They start searching for an escaped black convict who's supposedly hiding in Rosewood. They have no evidence he's there. They just know Rosewood is the nearest black community, so that's where they'll start. The mob comes to Rosewood, demanding residents turn over any strangers. The residents truthfully say there are no strangers, no escaped convicts, nobody hiding. The mob doesn't believe them. They start shooting. They lynch a man named Sam Carter, torturing him for information he doesn't have about a convict who isn't there. They shoot a woman named Lexi Gordon in her own home. And then the mob grows. White men from all over North Florida, some from as far as Georgia, hear there's a hunt happening, and they come to join. By January 4th, the mob numbers between 200 and 300 men. They burn Rosewood house by house. Families flee into the swamps with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They hide in the freezing water, children trying not to cry while white men with guns search for them. 2 white train conductors, showing more courage than any elected official, stop their train outside Rosewood and load black survivors into freight cars, hiding them under mail sacks, saving dozens of lives at risk to their own. When it's over, Rosewood is gone. Every black-owned building burned to the foundation. Every home, every business, the church, the school, all of it erased. Estimates of the death toll range from 8 to 150. Nobody knows because they hid the bodies, and survivors were too scared to talk. The survivors scattered across Florida and beyond, never returning, too terrified to even tell their children exactly what had happened. And here's the most insidious part of the Rosewood cover-up. They made it invisible. Wilmington and Elaine at least made the newspapers, even if the coverage was lies. Rosewood got almost no press coverage at all. A few local papers ran short articles about a disturbance. That's it. No investigation, no arrests, no trials. The white mob members went home and lived their lives. Some of them bragged about it. Some of them told their grandchildren they'd participated in running the Negroes out of Rosewood, said it with pride. For 70 years, Rosewood might as well have never existed. The land was taken over by white families. The cemetery was abandoned. The foundations of burned homes got covered by vegetation. If you drove through that area in 1950 or 1970 or 1990, you'd have no idea a thriving black town once stood there. The survivors didn't talk about it because the trauma was too deep and the fear was too real. If they'd gone public, they might have been killed. so they stayed silent, and Rosewood disappeared from history. It wasn't until 1982 that a journalist started investigating after hearing rumors from survivors' descendants. In 1994, Florida finally acknowledged the massacre and paid reparations. 21 survivors or descendants received $150,000 each. Total payout, $2.1 million, a fraction of what was stolen, and only because one journalist decided to dig up a truth that had been buried for nearly 70 years. Wilmington, 1898. Elaine, 1919. Rosewood, 1923. Can you see it now? The pattern is unmistakable. How did this happen? How did Greenwood get so rich? Oil. Oklahoma had oil booms in the early 1900s, and some black residents got lucky with land allotments that had oil underneath. But it wasn't just luck, it was strategy. Black entrepreneurs in Greenwood practiced what they called dollar circulation. Money earned in Greenwood stayed in Greenwood. You got your hair cut at a black barbershop, bought groceries from a black-owned store, saw a black doctor, hired black lawyers, kept the wealth circulating in the community instead of flowing out to white businesses. And it worked. Estimates suggest every dollar circulated in Greenwood 36 times before leaving the community. That kind of economic power is how you build generational wealth. That kind of economic power is why white Tulsa wanted it destroyed. May 31st, 1921. A young black man named Dick Rowland steps into an elevator operated by a white woman named Sarah Page. Something happens in that elevator. Maybe he trips. Maybe he accidentally steps on her foot. Maybe nothing happens at all. She screams. He runs, scared because he knows any interaction with a white woman can get him lynched. And the rumor starts immediately. A black man assaulted a white woman. By the next day, white newspapers are printing headlines calling for justice, meaning lynching. Dick Rowland gets arrested. A white mob gathers at the courthouse demanding he be turned over to them. Black veterans, men who fought in World War I, hear about the mob and go to the courthouse to protect Rowland. They're armed. They're trained. They're not going to let another lynching happen. Tensions escalate. Someone fires a shot. Nobody knows who. And all hell breaks loose. And here's what makes Tulsa unique. They used airplanes. Private planes flown by white pilots dropped incendiary bombs and fired rifles from the air. This was domestic aerial bombardment of American citizens on American soil. The only time in US history it's ever happened. They literally bombed Black Wall Street from the sky. The massacre lasted 18 hours, from the night of May 31st through the afternoon of June 1st. When it ended, the official death toll was 36 people. The real death toll, based on survivor testimony and mass graves discovered decades later, was likely around 300. 1,200 homes destroyed. 191 businesses burned. 10,000 black residents left homeless. The wealthiest black community in America reduced to smoking rubble in less than a day, and the cover-up was immediate and brutal. The Tulsa Tribune removed the original inflammatory article from its archives, physically cut it out of bound newspapers, so no one could prove what had started the riot. Police arrested black survivors, not white rioters. 6,000 black residents were detained in internment camps, not released until they had white sponsors vouch for them, like they were criminals instead of victims. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, calling it a riot instead of an insurrection, using policy loopholes to avoid paying millions owed. And Tulsa changed the building codes, requiring any reconstruction in Greenwood to be done with expensive fireproof materials most survivors couldn't afford. This prevented them from rebuilding, forced them to sell their land cheap, allowed white developers to buy up prime real estate for pennies on the dollar, But the worst part of the Tulsa cover-up was the silence. For 50 years, Tulsa didn't talk about it, didn't teach it in schools, didn't mention it in official histories. White families told their children and grandchildren they'd participated, showed off stolen jewelry and photographs looted from Greenwood homes, but the city itself pretended it never happened. Survivors were too traumatized and too scared to speak publicly. The massacre got called the Tulsa Race Riot and blamed on black aggression. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians started calling it what it was: a massacre, an act of domestic terrorism, a coordinated destruction of black wealth. And even now, in 2025, Tulsa still hasn't paid reparations. Survivors are dying. As of today, December 31st, 2025, there might be only 2 known survivors still alive, both over 100 years old, and Oklahoma keeps delaying, keeps appealing, keeps finding legal reasons why they don't have to compensate people who lost everything. Wilmington, 1898, Elaine, 1919, Rosewood, 1923, Tulsa, 1921, and Brownsville, 1906. 5 events spanning 23 years, different cities, different circumstances, same pattern. Do you see it now? Every time Black Americans build something, achieve something, create wealth or independence or success, there's a response. Destroy it. Blame the victims. Cover it up. Erase it from history. Make sure future generations don't know it happened, don't learn from it, don't ask for justice or reparations. This wasn't random violence. This was policy. This was strategy. This was America systematically preventing black wealth accumulation and black independence. Because if black communities could thrive, if black soldiers could be heroes, if black businesses could create millionaires, then the whole justification for white supremacy falls apart. You can't claim black people are inferior if they keep building empires every time you give them half a chance. So you don't give them a chance. You destroy the empires, you frame the heroes, you steal the wealth, and you make sure history forgets it ever existed. Brownsville 1906 fits perfectly into this pattern. 167 black soldiers proving themselves as warriors, as leaders, as equals. That couldn't be allowed. So they were framed, dishonored, erased. Same playbook as Wilmington, same tactics as Elaine, same result as Rosewood and Tulsa. The pattern is undeniable once you see it. And the question becomes, how did they get away with it? How did they make these events disappear from American consciousness? How did they prevent you from learning this in school, from seeing it in movies, from understanding your own history? That's what we need to expose next. The machinery of erasure, the system that buried these truths so deep you almost never found them. Physical destruction came first. You can't prosecute crimes if there's no evidence, so they made sure there was no evidence. At Fort Brown, after the Brownsville incident, military officials confiscated every rifle belonging to the 25th Infantry. They took personal weapons too, guns that soldiers had legally purchased themselves. They seized documentation, reports written by black soldiers or sympathetic white officers. Anything that might contradict the official story disappeared. The army burned records. Not all of them, they weren't that sloppy. But convenient documents that might have proven the soldiers' innocence went missing from archives. Ballistics reports that showed the shell casings didn't match military weapons. Witness statements from Mexican civilians across the border who saw white men in civilian clothes firing the shots. Maps showing the shooting positions were inconsistent with the official story. All gone, all destroyed, all unavailable for anyone trying to investigate later. They confiscated the soldiers' personal effects too. Letters, diaries, photographs, anything the discharged soldiers left behind when they were forced to leave immediately. Some of that material might still exist in military archives somewhere, but it's never been made fully public. Researchers requesting access get told records are lost or classified or damaged. Convenient excuses for convenient gaps in the historical record. This physical destruction happened at all 5 massacres. Wilmington, they burned the daily record and every copy of Black-owned newspapers they could find. They destroyed property records showing Black ownership of homes and businesses. They made sure there was no paper trail proving what Black residents had lost. Elaine, mass graves were left unmarked. Bodies dumped in the Mississippi River were never recovered, never counted, never identified. No bodies, no murder charges. Rosewood, everything burned. No buildings, no evidence, no proof the town ever existed at a certain level of prosperity. Tulsa, they bulldozed the ruins of Greenwood before survivors could document what they'd lost. They destroyed photographs. They seized documentation of property ownership so Black families couldn't prove what they'd owned before the massacre. See the pattern? First you commit the crime, then you destroy the evidence, then you control the narrative. And that brings us to legal suppression. The law became a weapon to silence survivors and prevent justice. After Brownsville, President Roosevelt issued that executive order on August 25, 1906. It wasn't just a discharge, it was a legal trap. The order stated that any soldier who wanted to appeal had to prove their innocence. Prove a negative. Prove you didn't do something. That's impossible. You can't prove you weren't somewhere when multiple white witnesses are lying and saying you were. You can't prove you didn't fire a gun when the authorities won't do ballistics testing. You can't prove innocence when the entire system is designed to assume your guilt. And the punishment included a provision that the soldiers could never enlist in military or government service again. They were blacklisted. Even if they somehow cleared their names, even if evidence emerged proving the frame-up, they could never get their careers back. They couldn't work for the post office, couldn't work for any federal agency, couldn't serve in any branch of military. One order, one moment, and 167 men were permanently marked as criminals. Then in 1910, 4 years after Brownsville, Congress passed the Army Reorganization Act. Officially, it was about modernizing the military. Unofficially, it was about removing Black units. The act gave the Army authority to consolidate and eliminate regiments. Guess which ones got eliminated first? Black regiments. The Buffalo Soldier units that had served with distinction for 40 years got broken up, scattered, or disbanded entirely. By World War I, the Army had dramatically reduced the number of Black soldiers and officers. By World War II, Black troops were segregated into labor units, kept away from combat, prevented from earning the glory that might challenge white supremacy. Brownsville was the excuse, the justification. If Black soldiers can't be trusted, if they riot and attack civilians, then obviously they need to be controlled, limited, removed. Wilmington saw legal suppression through the coup itself. The white supremacists who overthrew the government weren't just tolerated, they were legitimized. North Carolina recognized their new government as legal. The expelled Black officials never got their positions back. Laws were passed making it harder for Black residents to vote, to own property, to run businesses in Wilmington. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised equal protection and voting rights. North Carolina and other southern states ignored those promises, and the federal government led them. For 70 years. After Elaine, Arkansas used the legal system to prosecute survivors while ignoring the white mob. 285 Black residents arrested, 12 sentenced to death. The message was clear. If you're Black and you survive a massacre, you'll be charged with causing it. The trials were legal lynchings, all-white juries, defense attorneys who barely tried, guilty verdicts delivered in minutes. The NAACP spent years fighting those convictions, finally winning in the Supreme Court case Moore v. Dempsey in 1923. That case established that trials dominated by mob influence violate due process. It was a legal victory, but it came 4 years too late for the people who'd been terrorized, and it didn't result in any prosecutions of the actual murderers. The white men who killed hundreds of black sharecroppers never faced charges, never faced trial, never faced consequences. Rosewood saw legal suppression through complete inaction. Florida investigated nothing, charged no one, held no trials. The survivors had no legal recourse at all. They couldn't sue for property losses because they'd have to file in local Florida courts, where white judges and white juries would laugh them out. They couldn't get federal intervention because the federal government claimed this was a state matter. They were trapped in a legal void where their rights existed on paper, but not in practice. Tulsa used legal mechanisms to prevent rebuilding. Those building codes I mentioned earlier, requiring fireproof construction, that was law, legal, official, and it had the effect of preventing black survivors from rebuilding Black Wall Street. Combine that with insurance companies refusing to pay, using policy loopholes that courts upheld, and you have a legal system that protected white perpetrators while punishing black victims. To this day, survivors trying to get reparations face legal obstacles, statutes of limitations, sovereign immunity, standing to sue. Every technical legal barrier you can imagine gets thrown up to prevent compensation. The law wasn't neutral. The law was a weapon, and it worked. But physical and legal suppression only work if people know something happened. The real genius of the cover-up was making sure people never learned the truth in the first place. That's where educational erasure comes in. History is written by the victors, and for most of American history, that meant white historians writing white versions of events for white audiences. Brownsville got erased from textbooks. When it was mentioned at all, it was presented exactly as Roosevelt framed it. Negro troops rioted. The president had no choice but to discharge them. End of story. No mention of the evidence problems. No mention of the white mob. No mention of the alternative explanations. Just the official version, repeated in book after book, taught to generation after generation of students who had no reason to question it. West Point, the United States Military Academy, where Army officers are trained, didn't teach about Brownsville for 90 years. Think about that. An event that involved 167 soldiers, that set the precedent for how the military treats black troops, that was ordered by a sitting president, and the Army's own officer training school pretended it didn't happen. They taught about Roosevelt's military career. They taught about Buffalo soldiers in the abstract, these brave frontier troops. They didn't connect the dots, didn't explain what happened when those brave troops got framed and destroyed. It wasn't until the 1990s that West Point started including Brownsville in its curriculum, and even then it's often glossed over, presented as a tragic misunderstanding rather than a deliberate injustice. Public schools were worse. Most American students graduate high school without ever hearing the name Brownsville in a historical context. They learn about Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster, Roosevelt the conservationist, Roosevelt the Rough Rider. They don't learn about Roosevelt the racist who destroyed 167 lives because it was politically convenient. That's not an accident. Textbook companies write for their markets. Texas and California, the two biggest textbook markets in America, effectively control what goes into history books nationwide. And for most of the 20th century, those states wanted sanitized history, happy history, history where America always did the right thing, and when mistakes were made, they were honest errors, not deliberate cruelty. Wilmington got the same treatment. For 93 years, from 1898 to 1991, North Carolina schools didn't teach about the coup. Students learned about Reconstruction. They learned about the Civil War. They somehow managed to skip right over the part where white supremacists violently overthrew a legitimately elected government, and the federal government led them. When it was mentioned in North Carolina history books, it was called the Wilmington Race Riot and framed as black aggression met with white self-defense. The victims became the perpetrators. The perpetrators became heroes defending their city. That's what North Carolina children learned for nearly a century. A complete inversion of truth. Elaine disappeared from Arkansas education. Rosewood wasn't taught in Florida schools until the 1990s. Tulsa wasn't in Oklahoma textbooks until the 2000s. We're talking about massive events, hundreds of deaths, entire communities destroyed, and they simply weren't part of the curriculum. Students graduated, went to college, became teachers themselves, and never knew these massacres happened. That's how you erase history. Not by burning books, though they did that too, but by simply not including the truth in the first place. By writing textbooks that skip over inconvenient facts. By creating a historical narrative where black suffering doesn't count, black achievements don't matter, and white crimes are forgotten. Even now, in 2025, most states don't require teaching about these events. There's been progress. More schools include Tulsa. Some mention Rosewood, but it's optional in most places. A teacher who wants to cover it can. A teacher who doesn't want to deal with controversy can skip it. And many do. Because teaching about Wilmington or Elaine or Tulsa means teaching about white violence. It means teaching that America systematically destroyed black wealth. It means confronting uncomfortable truths that challenge the narrative of American exceptionalism. That's hard. That's controversial. That gets parents angry and school boards nervous. So many teachers take the path of least resistance. They teach the safe version of history. And another generation grows up not knowing. Educational erasure extends beyond K through 12 schools. University history departments ignored these events for decades. Historians focusing on black history were marginalized, told their work wasn't serious scholarship, denied tenure. The few who did research on massacres like Tulsa or Rosewood struggled to get published. Academic journals weren't interested. University presses passed. The gatekeepers of historical knowledge decided these stories didn't matter. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that black historians started pushing back hard, demanding space in academia, demanding recognition that black history is American history. And even then, progress was slow. John Hope Franklin published his groundbreaking history of Tulsa in the late 1990s. A report on Rosewood came out in 1993. Wilmington got serious academic attention in the early 2000s. We're talking about events from 1898 to 1923 that didn't get thorough, honest academic treatment until 70 to 100 years later. That's not an accident. That's systematic erasure. And it worked. Ask any American over 40 what they learned about Brownsville or Tulsa or Rosewood in school. Most will say they never heard of them. They learned about slavery, maybe. They learned about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. They got the sanitized version of civil rights, the one where peaceful protest led to progress, and now everything's better. They didn't learn about the massacres. They didn't learn about the systematic destruction of black wealth. They didn't learn about Brownsville. And if you don't learn about it, how can you demand justice for it? How can you understand that reparations aren't a handout? They're repayment for theft. You can't. That's the point. Educational erasure ensures each generation starts from ignorance, has to rediscover these truths, and by the time they do, The perpetrators are dead, the evidence is scattered, and the window for justice has supposedly closed. But educational erasure only works if it's reinforced. And that's where media manipulation comes in, the final piece of the suppression mechanism. The media in 1906 was newspapers. That's it. No TV, no internet, no social media. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you read the newspaper. And newspapers in 1906 were openly, shamelessly racist. They printed slurs in headlines. They referred to black people as Negroes or colored at best, much worse at worst. They presented black crime, real or imagined, as evidence of racial inferiority. And they loved stories about black savagery, black violence, black people threatening white civilization. That was the context when Brownsville happened. The New York Times, supposedly the paper of record, ran headlines calling the Brownsville shooting evidence of Negro savagery. Not alleged Negro violence, not accused soldiers, savagery, as if it were proven fact before any investigation. The Times printed Roosevelt's version of events without question, without skepticism, without bothering to interview the soldiers or examine the evidence. They framed it as brave president standing firm against military misconduct. They praised Roosevelt for his decisiveness in discharging all 167 men. Editorials supported the decision, arguing that black soldiers clearly couldn't be trusted, that the discharge was necessary to maintain military discipline and white safety. Other newspapers followed the Times' lead. The Associated Press, which provided news to papers across the country, distributed stories that repeated Roosevelt's framing. Local papers from Texas to Maine ran the same narrative. Black soldiers riot. Innocent white people nearly killed. President takes decisive action. Order restored. That's what Americans read. That's what they believed. And when Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio, one of the few white politicians who tried to defend the soldiers, pushed for congressional hearings, newspapers attacked him. They called him a race traitor, a political opportunist, someone willing to endanger white Americans for political gain. The media made it dangerous to defend the truth. Now, some black newspapers pushed back. Papers like the Chicago Defender and the New York Age, which served black communities, printed alternative versions of events. They interviewed soldiers. They questioned the official story. They pointed out the evidence problems and the lack of a fair trial. But black newspapers had tiny circulations compared to white papers. They reached black readers who already suspected the truth, but had no power to change it. They didn't reach white Americans who might have demanded justice if they'd known the facts. And white newspapers ignored what black papers were reporting, acted like those papers didn't exist, created a media environment where white America only heard one version of Brownsville, the false one, and never had reason to question it. The same media manipulation happened with all the massacres. Wilmington in 1898 got covered by North Carolina papers as heroic white men defending their city against Negro rule. Papers described the coup as redemption, liberation, white men taking back what was rightfully theirs. They printed interviews with coup leaders who openly admitted to planning the violence, and those interviews were presented as brave men saving civilization. The Daily Record, the black newspaper in Wilmington, got destroyed in the coup, so there was no black media voice to counter the lies. And national papers mostly ignored Wilmington or repeated the white North Carolina version. Elaine in 1919 got reported as a Negro uprising. Papers claimed black sharecroppers were planning to massacre white plantation owners, and white men defended themselves. Zero evidence supported this. The evidence showed sharecroppers organizing a legal union and being massacred for it. But that's not what newspapers printed. They printed the governor's lies. They printed law enforcement's lies. They created a narrative where the victims were the villains and the murderers were heroes. And most Americans never heard anything different. Rosewood barely got covered at all, which might be the most effective media manipulation of all. If nobody hears about it, nobody asks questions. A few Florida papers ran short articles about a disturbance. That's it. No investigative reporting, no follow-up, no national coverage. Rosewood got memory hold in real time, disappeared so completely that most Americans in 1923 had no idea it happened. Tulsa got covered more because it was impossible to ignore. 35 blocks burned, thousands homeless. But the coverage was still manipulated. Headlines called it the Tulsa Race Riot, implying both sides fought equally. They emphasized black aggression at the courthouse as the cause. They downplayed or ignored the white mob's systematic looting and burning. They didn't mention the airplanes, didn't mention the police arming white rioters, didn't mention that black Greenwood residents were detained while white perpetrators walked free. National papers ran stories for a few days, then moved on. No sustained coverage, no demands for federal investigation, no calls for prosecuting the white mob leaders whose names were known. The media created a narrative where Tulsa was a tragedy, sure, but an understandable response to black aggression. Then they stopped covering it and let it fade from national consciousness. Media manipulation didn't stop with the initial coverage. For decades after these events, media outlets reinforced the lies. Movies and TV shows, when they depicted black soldiers or black communities at all, presented stereotypes. Dangerous black criminals, grateful subservient black servants. They didn't show Buffalo soldiers as heroes. They didn't show Greenwood as prosperous. They showed what white audiences wanted to see, what confirmed their prejudices, what justified the existing racial hierarchy. When Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, glorifying the Ku Klux Klan and presenting black people as violent threats to white civilization, it became one of the most successful films ever made. Presidents screened it at the White House. It shaped how generations of white Americans viewed black people and Reconstruction. That's media manipulation on a massive scale. Even as late as the 1980s and 1990s, when some of these stories started emerging again, media coverage was tentative. Reporters would present it as an interesting historical footnote, not a massive injustice demanding current action. They'd interview historians who'd say, yes, this was terrible, and then the story would end. No follow-up on reparations, no investigation into why it took so long to acknowledge, no connection to current racial wealth gaps or ongoing discrimination. Just acknowledgement without accountability. That's still manipulation. That's still controlling the narrative to minimize white discomfort and avoid demands for justice. Who were the key players in all this suppression? Start with Theodore Roosevelt himself. He signed the discharge order. He refused to reconsider even when evidence emerged suggesting the soldiers were innocent. He used Brownsville politically, proving to white Southern Democrats that he'd protect white supremacy, even at the expense of black soldiers who'd helped him win. Major Charles Penrose, the commanding officer at Fort Brown, collected evidence he knew exonerated his troops and suppressed it to protect his own career. Major August Bloxham conducted an investigation designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Senator Joseph Foraker fought for the soldiers and got destroyed politically for it, proving that defending black people could end a white politician's career. In Wilmington, the coup leaders were men like Alfred Moore Waddell, who became mayor after the violence and held the position for years. A respected businessman and politician who led a massacre and suffered no consequences. In Elaine, Governor Charles Breaux personally spread the lies about a Negro uprising and never faced accountability. In Tulsa, Police Chief John Gustafson armed white rioters and later claimed he was trying to restore order. City officials bulldozed Greenwood ruins before survivors could document losses. All of these men, white men in positions of power, chose violence and suppression, choose lies over truth, and none of them paid a price. That's the suppression mechanism. Physical destruction of evidence, legal barriers to justice, educational erasure from textbooks and curricula, media manipulation creating false narratives, and powerful white men coordinating it all, protecting each other, ensuring no one faced consequences. It's not a conspiracy theory if it's documented, if you can name the people involved and describe what they did. This happened. This is how they buried the truth. And this is why you're only learning about it now, instead of having known your whole life. But here's the thing they didn't count on. Eventually, the truth comes out. Survivors tell their grandchildren. Researchers dig through archives. Journalists investigate. And piece by piece, the lies fall apart. We're living in that moment right now. The moment where all these buried truths are surfacing. Where you're finding out what they did. Where you're connecting the dots between Brownsville and Wilmington, and Elaine and Rosewood and Tulsa, and dozens of other events just like them. And once you see it, once you understand the pattern and the mechanism, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to not knowing, and that changes everything.